The New Testament lesson today is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 through 23. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I forgot to share an announcement with you a few moments ago, but I do want you to see you should have received your annual report in the mail. Of course, it goes through last year and has information for all of our members. If you did not get it, or if you do not get it in the next week, please let Sheila know in the office, and she will make sure that you get one. Sheila's done a wonderful job in putting our annual report together. It's very informative and very beautifully done, and I appreciate her working so hard to bring the report to us. But please take a moment to look at it and see all the information that is there. If you have any questions about our annual report, please feel free to call me on my cell phone or call me at the office. Again, we urge you that if you have not received it, that you let us know, and we will make sure that you get it. When my wife, Amy, was first diagnosed by a specialist with ME/CFS, or as it was called then, chronic fatigue, she had a very difficult time convincing her other doctors, such as her internal medicine physician, that her diagnosis was real and affected every aspect of her physical health. As she continued to hit a medical wall in the presentation of the many symptoms that are associated with ME/CFS, Amy came across a book titled How Doctors Think. You may be familiar with the book. You may have even read it. It was written in 2008 by Dr. Jerome Groopman, and in the book explains how physicians are trained in medical school to diagnose their patients, a process that is not open to creative thinking or even careful listening to the patient's description of the symptoms. It's called a diagnostic tree, and they use tests and other things, but they really have their own technique and very narrow method in diagnosing patients. Although the resistance to complex medical conditions like ME/CFS still exists throughout the medical community, at least now Amy understands how a doctor is thinking from a clinical aspect the moment that she first meets them. Amy still meets resistance from physicians, but she understands their skepticism in a way that helps her not to take it personally or make her feel that her medical problems are all psychological. By the way, it now appears that ME/CFS is a common post-COVID-19 development in many surviving patients, which is challenging and even changing the diagnostic gridlock that Amy and the many who suffer like her have been facing now for decades. And that's good. It means there's hope for her and the other patients of ME/CFS. How Doctors Think is just one of many books that try to give us understanding from a specific point of view, as one quick search on Amazon will prove. Searching under the title, How to Think Like ... the results are not just limited to professions. There are, of course, titles that focus on professions such as how to think like a mathematician, how to think like a computer scientist, how to think like a manager. But other titles focus on archetypes, such as how to think like a millionaire and how to think like a warrior. Still, other titles invite us to emulate historical figures, such as how to think like Shakespeare or how to think like Einstein. That's ambitious, isn't it? Some of these books go beyond human subjects. How to think like a cat, or how to think like a dog, how to think like a horse, or how to think like a fish, which, by the way, is not for people who have an aquarium. It's for people who go fishing. They want to think like a fish. One of the titles I saw among the many that made me laugh was How to Think Like a Pancreas. But after I read the description, I ordered the book. Now that I'm reading it, I have realized that it is really a great book. One of the best I have ever read on managing diabetes, which I have. If you are diabetic, thinking like a pancreas makes perfect sense. The Apostle Paul could have written his own books about how to think like different types of people. In fact, in his letter to the church in Corinth, he goes beyond describing those whom he has sought to think like and says he has actually become those people. Then explains why. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that I might by any means save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings. For the past several weeks, my sermons have focused on Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and the circumstances that prompted Paul to write to this struggling congregation and respond to their leadership who had written Paul. You might recall that the leaders in the congregation, the Gentile leaders, have written the apostle, challenging his authority regarding a specific issue. Being a majority Gentile church in a city with a Greek culture, the Gentile leaders are telling their Gentile brethren, all of whom were formerly pagans before Paul converted them to Christianity, that it is fine for them to participate in the cultic meals in the temples of the gods in Corinth, since the leaders know that the gods of the Greeks and the Romans, along with the mystic pagan deities, are not real. And since the leaders have this knowledge, they should think like them and have this knowledge too. And therefore then they can go and participate in the cultic meals without fear of falling back into their pagan lives. Paul is concerned that the weaker or newer members of the church may forsake their Christianity if they begin to participate in the temple life of the gods, since it was already difficult enough to be a Christian in a pagan city. Paul recognizes the temptation for these weaker members to return to their pre-Christian lives. Paul is also highly critical of those congregational leaders who claim that they have superior knowledge and having superior knowledge in their attitude toward the gods and the cultic meals. They claim that other members of the church should think just like they do and exercise the same freedom that they exercise. Paul explains that just because these leaders have the right to eat at the temples without fear of losing their faith, that doesn't make it right for them to do so, especially if it places their Christian sisters and brothers at spiritual risk. In defending his argument that the church's leaders must not use their spiritual knowledge to force other Christians to think like they do, Paul points to his own radical freedom as an apostle called by Christ. Paul describes this freedom as a freedom not to do what he wants, but to embrace the life that Christ has compelled him to embrace. This is what he writes, and it's a difficult passage, but listen to it. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe betide me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. Now, what is Paul talking about here? Because it's really a difficult passage. Well, Paul reminds the leaders at Corinth that he did not receive any remuneration as their leader when he was with them, although he had the right to be paid. Instead, he used his talent as a fabricator of tents, as a tent maker, to pay his own way. Why did he do this? Paul tells them because he sees himself as a servant. Indeed, the word means slave to the call of Christ. Therefore, for Paul, it was right for him not to ask for any pay as the one by whom they heard the good news of Christ's salvation, since he had no other choice but to obey the commission that he had received on the road to Damascus, the commission that changed his life, that obligated him to do what he was doing. That call, that commission, freed Paul to become whatever he needed to become in order to save souls. Paul wants the leaders of the Corinthian church to understand that before he was their leader and before he was the founder of their church, he was a servant to Christ, and being a servant to Christ, he was therefore a servant to all of them in the congregation, a servant. Therefore, Paul has no right to think the way that he wishes, but must take on the thoughts of those for whom he is proclaiming the gospel. Furthermore, Paul has no right to demand that those to whom he proclaims the gospel think like he does. Rather, he must become as they are, whatever their situation may be, in order to reach their hearts, in order to bring them the good news of Christ's love. In his letter, Paul calls on the leaders of the congregation to do the same thing. Like Paul, they do not have to change what they know about eating the food in the pagan temples. They know it will do them no personal harm to their faith if they do so. But if the leaders live for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ, even though they are spiritually strong themselves, they must think like and even become like the spiritually weaker members of the congregation who may fall away from their faith if they are compelled to eat in the temples. Not sharing in the temple meals for the sake of their weaker brethren is a labor of love for the sake of the gospel, just as Paul has become like the many with whom Christ destined him to share the good news. Now, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the church? Christian author and minister Jennifer Hatmaker fell under extreme criticism when she declared to her evangelical congregation that they must not exclude anyone from the love of their fellowship or from the love of Christ, including those in the LGBTQ community. And that's why she continues to receive so much criticism from the evangelical community. In her book, Interrupted, When Jesus Wrecks Your Comfortable Christianity, she explains why she spoke out. And her words truly rephrase what Paul is trying to tell the leaders in Corinth. This is what she says. Quote, "I worry the Christian community has accepted an insidious shift from laboring for others to prioritizing our own rights. We've perpetuated a group identity as misunderstood and persecuted, defending our positions and preferring to be right over being good news. We've bought the lie that connecting with people on their terms is somehow compromising our faith. It has become more vital to protect our own station than advocate for a world that needs Jesus, who came to us wrapped in our skin, speaking our language. If we were not two beneath Christ, who died for us while we were still sinners, then how dare we take a superior position over any other human being? Then she concludes, how lovely is a faith community that goes forth as loving sisters and brothers rather than angry defenders and separatists. That's a word the church needs to hear in everything that it does. Not only is it lovely for the faith community to live its life as Jennifer Hatmaker describes, it is our labor of love for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is why you and I, thinking vastly different things and living in vastly different ways, come together at this table of grace today. It's true that sharing the Lord's Supper is a part of our discipline and our obedience as followers of Christ, but it is also a humbling of ourselves to God and to each other, a humbling of ourselves with a greater purpose. That purpose was perfectly expressed by Minister Charles Swindoll when he wrote these words. Jesus did not come to earth to establish a new religion. He came to restore a broken relationship. He came to make the primary again. The secondary activity of obedience to the law of God was always intended to serve the primary activity, to love God and to enjoy God forever. When that is primary, the secondary becomes a labor of love, a joyful and easy burden to bear. This table this morning, physically here in front of me and spiritually in front of you, this table reminds us that we are a part of God's labor of love for this world. Here we humble ourselves, acknowledging that we must think like those this day who hunger for Christ's love, wherever they are. And if we think like that and know this hunger, then we must feed them and feed each other the bread of life. The bread of life. That is the daily bread for which Jesus taught us to pray and that we gather now to share. So, let us come to the table, sisters and brothers from different places, with different lives, with different ideas, but coming together to share the table with each other and those that we know, which includes, by the way, the whole world. A world that is hungry for the love of Christ. As we prepare our hearts to share the table this morning,